Hey everyone, welcome to a very special edition on GMAT Club Live. We have Charles from GMAT Ninja. I wish I could give you a drum roll, Charles, but I'm still sheltering in place, right? But you look great. How have you been?
Can't complain at all. How about you? Hair looks fantastic.
So that's my only thing. I'm looking a little bit disheveled, right? So I moved to Seattle finally, but I still haven't. My hair and makeup person hasn't arrived yet, so I'm sort of have to like take things on my own. But everything else pretty good. I just moved to Seattle. I think I've been doing a lot of videos on like my MBA journey on the GMAT Club channel. So as some of you know, like I finished my 2 years at the Michigan Raw School of Business. I'm a freshly minted alum, and I moved to Seattle to start working with Amazon. But anyway, so I wanted to do a video on GRE versus GMAT, and I wanted to have Charles on board. We have an exciting announcement. If you don't follow GMAT Club very regularly, you may not have seen it, so I'll let Charles handle that. But before that, my GRE video on this channel was a little bit problematic because I had really bad internet back in Florida. So I wanted to change that and like get some expert views on some of the things that I conjured in my head about one test versus the other. So right before we jump in, we have a bunch of people online. We're going to keep getting questions, right? So I'm going to ask people to post their questions. We'll get to them at the end. But just to give everybody a little bit of background, I took both the GMAT and the GRE, the home editions, right? My GMAT was on April 21st, and my GRE was like 2 weeks after. And my GMAT online score was a 740. I scored a Q49 and a V42, I think, at a full score at IR. I took the GRE. For GRE, my score was 331 overall. My quant was 168, and my verbal was 163. And if you translate those two scores, like the overall scores, they're actually the same, which was really annoying to me because I've been practicing the GRE to GMAT conversion tool forever. They both sort of equate to a 740, 750 GMAT. So that's sort of the background, right? So Charles, I wanted to ask you my first question before we jump into actual serious questions. Are you surprised at all that I scored the same percentile for both the tests? Especially because I didn't prep for the GRE at all. Like I went in blind.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm definitely not shocked by the quant score. So 168, top of the heap. That's about what I'd expect. For most people, GRE quant is going to feel much, much easier than GMAT quant for a bunch of reasons that we'll get into as we continue. Verbal, I'm a little bit surprised for you. I mean, the verbal seems a little bit low actually on the GRE for you, but I'm probably arguing about a point or two, right? Like 163 is a super, super strong score on GRE verbal. And the big difference there obviously is what are you stronger at? Sentence correction, which shows up on the GMAT, or the vocabulary questions that are on the GRE. Right. So if your vocab's a little bit weaker than I expect as a smart Ross School of Management graduate, then maybe that would cost you a point or two. But it's not a shot. For what it's worth, I'm not a fan of that conversion tool, and we want to get into that a little bit later as well. For most people, those aren't going to match perfectly. So it's kind of funny that they did. But I think if you'd spent maybe a little bit of time getting used to the GRE, I'd expect you a little bit higher on the verbal. Yeah. But that's just because I know you and I know how well you write, and I know that your vocabulary is really strong.
Yeah, so like there are certain probably this is a digress, but I'm gonna digress on purpose. So there are certain words, like that the GRE loves those words, and every time you see them, it's like the next time I take a test, I would remember what this means. And there are some words that I knew, like they're like pop culture words, things like hubris, right? Hubris came up on my test. Esoteric came up on my test. But there are some words that I said, I know that this word exists, right? I just don't know what it means, and that was annoying. But yeah, so let's jump in. We're getting questions already. Thanks for that, everybody. Welcome to the chat, and keep the questions coming. We'll get to them after my set of questions. But my first question for you, Charles, is for someone who hasn't taken the GRE, hasn't taken the GMAT, right? So just thinking about business school or whatever grad school you have, right? and trying to figure out which test is the best for him or her, right? What's the step to actually figure it out? Is it taking a practice test for both of those? Is it something else? Is it asking their parents? What would be your advice?
I mean, my feeling on it, so if we're talking about MBA applicants, so no dual degree programs or other master's degrees for now. So if you're applying, obviously, if you're applying to programs that only accept the GRE that are not MBA programs, that changes the calculation. But if we're just talking about you're chasing an elite MBA, my take on it is that business schools, yes, all of them or nearly all of them accept the GRE, but they've always been more comfortable with the GMAT. There's a longer history. There's this feeling that they understand what these scores are. So my take on it is if you can get an elite score on the GMAT, whatever that might mean for your target program, you should absolutely go chase that elite score on the GMAT. And I think there's no point in thinking about the GRE if you can get to that elite score.
Right.
Now, the complicated thing is, what does that mean? It depends on where you're applying. It depends on your profile. And I don't think we need to go too crazy on that. There's tons and tons of content on GMAT Club where we get into, well, hey, what does a 750 get me? What does a 700 get me? Right. What are my odds in this demographic? But if you think you can be at the top of the heap for whatever your profile is on the GMAT, take the GMAT, no doubt about it. If you're not sure you can get there, that's when I think the GRE starts to become a viable option.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. And I also think I prefer the GMAT, okay? They're just way out there. But that's also because, I've been around the GMAT for a long time. But at the same time, I feel like the GMAT is a more acceptable score. And I think that might change. That might change. Yeah, if the GRE has been around for a while now. And I think schools take the GRE very, very seriously now. But at the same time, I feel like they have so much historical data on the GMAT, right? There have been studies done on GMAT versus success, GMAT versus business school GPA, some of which bunk the importance of the GMAT. But
most of which do.
Yeah.
The correlation between the GMAT and any other life outcome is pretty minimal, depending on which study you look at for what it's worth. But the other factor here, the elephant in the room, is that the GMAT is still part of a lot of the MBA rankings.
Right.
And that is the biggest factor, I think, that drives the arms race that we've been going through for 10 or 15 years in particular. When I was tutoring 20 years ago, we could just say, get a 700 and shut up. That's it.
Yeah.
And now I imagine that, anybody watching who's chasing, let's say, a top 10, top 15 MBA, for most of you, somebody's told you 700 might not be enough, depends on your profile. And a lot of that is driven by the rankings because schools have been climbing all over each other to try to get their averages up. And now there are schools whose averages are 730, pushing 740. GRE is not part of the rankings. So that's the other factor. That's part of why I say if you can get a mind-blowingly great score on the GMAT, do it. Don't look back. It helps the school's rankings, and you are doing something positive for the school's rankings. They want you. GRE does nothing for their rankings, good or bad. So I think that the way to think about it is if your GMAT score is going to help their rankings, GMAT. Yeah. If your GMAT score is going to hurt their rankings,
the GRE.
GRE. I think
that's a really good framework to think about that, because I'm going to throw you more questions like what is really that sweet spot, right? But I'm going to get to nitty-gritties in a bit. But before that, let me throw you this one. Let's say I started preparing for the GMAT, right? Let's say I started preparing for the GMAT, but let's say I'm 3 weeks in, right? So I took a practice test and I got maybe I think my practice test from a test from Manhattan was a 670. I think that's where I started with sort of zero prep. Let's say you scored a 650, right? And then you sort of prepped a little bit. You sort of browsed around GMAT Club. You got deeply disappointed from Buñuel's questions. and then sort of have this moment of crisis. Okay, the GMAT seems too difficult. Can I switch to GRE? So then what's the process if you're 1 month into the GMAT and you've realized that, okay, GRE is probably a better idea, but you still don't know? How do you make that switch?
Yeah, it's a great question. Probably the most obvious thing to do. I mean, number one, you want to get your head around the admission situation for yourself. So I definitely see candidates all the time. I saw somebody joining us from Ecuador. We tend to have a shortage of South Americans applying to US MBA programs. So for example, for Alex, if your profile is magnificent, your test score is going to matter less. That's just reality. If you're a hot commodity as an applicant, That's
Right.
going to very much inform this decision.
Yeah.
So if I see somebody who's from an underrepresented country or an underrepresented minority, for example, or just has a mind-blowing profile, I tend to go, yeah, GRE, just get a GRE score that's good enough for schools to go, I think this person's going to handle the work just fine. Maybe get above a 160 on quant, get close to a 160 on verbal, we're done. So I'd say step one is figure out where you stand in the admissions game, and maybe you need to talk to a good admissions consultant if that helps, or reach out to folks on GMAT Club in the admissions consulting section.
Right.
So that's step one. Step two, obviously, if you're already in that situation where you're getting something that you think is too low on the GMAT, you've studied a bit, yeah, go take a GRE practice test, an official one, please. Go to ets.org. There's only 5 official tests. Please take one of them. They're the only things that are accurate. GRE
free? Sorry about this really noob question.
Sorry?
Are all of those ETS practice tests free?
No, unfortunately. So 2 are, if I'm not mistaken, 2 are free, 3 are paid, and I don't think they're inexpensive either. I want to say they're charging you, I want to say it's $50 a test, but don't quote me on that.
Following the GMAT model. Interesting.
And they're very shallow question banks. So when you do the MBA.com official GMAT test, you take that first test, for example, that's a big question bank. You can go take it again, and you're not going to see a ton of repeats.
Right.
GRE tests, the official ones, you're pretty much one and done. If you go retake it, you're going to see 50, 80% overlap. It's unfortunate. So be really, really careful with those. But I would recommend taking one official practice test, see how you do. And I'd say that's the biggest step too. But again, the step one is get your head around where you stand in the admissions game first, because if schools are going to go, well, we've got all sorts of people that look like you as an applicant who are scoring 760s on the GMAT, maybe the GREs, you might be in trouble. And again, if you're a hot commodity and they're going to love you with a 700 GMAT and they're going to love you with a pair of 160s on the GRE, maybe the GRE is a lower bar.
I have follow-ups on that, but I'm going to reserve those follow-ups at the end because I really want to ask the reverse question. Right? So you started your prep and you realized that the GMAT is too quant heavy, and you started on the GRE, right? And then you realize, like memorizing thousands of words is not your cup of tea either, right? It's definitely not my cup of tea. Like, I would be awful at that. So then you want to pivot to the GMAT. Like 1 month into the GRE, let's say you're scoring, I don't know, like a 315, 320-ish, and you want to pivot to the GMAT. How do you do that? Should you do that?
I'm sorry, I missed that last part, Souvik. You said if you're getting a 315 or a 320 and you want to pivot to the GMAT from the GRE?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Well, again, I think it's so context dependent on your application. So if you say, hey, I'm close to a 320, I'd go, well, if your profile is pretty good, I'm great with that. And I think on the GRE, part of how it operates in the minds of admissions committee members, yes, there's a conversion tool out there. No, it is not very accurate. GMAT actually produced a statement that I thought was spot on about 10 years ago that said, don't use this tool. These two tests are different. You're going to have a lot of error when you convert. I think GMAT's right about it. People still use the tool. That's one thought. Second thought, people look at percentiles. But my theory is a little bit different. I think most people, since GRE scores aren't part of the rankings, I don't know that anybody really understands or really cares about the difference between a 163 quant and a 161 quant. What do those 2 points mean? How do we contextualize that? Nobody knows. But I do think that if 150, since 150 is the average score, roughly, 170 is perfect. I think the key psychological threshold, crack that 160.
Yeah.
Ideally, you do it on both sections. So it's something like a 320, or if you're close to a 320, do you really need to even think about the GMAT? Depends on your application, unfortunately. But if for some reason you start with the GRE and you're trying to make the pivot to the GMAT, I think for most people it's tougher. You've got to deal with sentence correction, thing one. Thing two is that the things that make the GMAT much harder, I'd say there's 3 big factors. Sentence correction, maybe harder, maybe not, depends on your taste. Second, GMAT quant is so much more nuanced, has so much more depth. And third, and for some people this is by far the biggest thing, is that you can't skip around on the GMAT. It's a one-way street. I think probably everybody watching this knows that. You have to answer a question before you see the next one. So you've got that tension of, how much time do I spend on this question? How much time do I spend on this question? What if it's an easy one? And you can drive yourself crazy on the GMAT. GRE, you get blocks of 20 questions. You want to skip around? Skip around. You want to do the evens and then the odds? knock yourself out. And I think especially if you're prone to anxiety, if time management's a struggle for you, GRE can calm you down a little bit. You can control the timing on the GRE much, much better. And that is a huge factor. And depending on the test taker, that might be the thing that totally makes the decision. And we see students like that all the time who have anxiety, really struggle with their time management. GRE, there's no penalty to skip. You can mark it. There's a review screen you can go back to. You can see exactly what you've omitted. You can see exactly what you've marked. And that, for a lot of people, is the biggest reason to stick with the GRE. But if you don't love your GRE scores at first, you want to pivot to the GMAT, okay, just be aware quant's going to be a lot more depth. You got to deal with sense correction, the grammar stuff. And then you also have to deal with this very, very different way of handling time management.
To be honest on that note, because I took the GRE from such a GMAT mindset, right? This never even happened to me that I'm going to look at a question and I'm going to tell myself that, oh, I spent a minute on this question, right? I'm going to come back to this question. I never went back to a question. And maybe that is a good idea to go back to the questions. I think there are two ways of looking at it. Number one is you're going to take a lot of time on this question, right? So you sort of review it for later. Or you couldn't do it and you want to come back to it later, right? I think for the first one, I would definitely do that. I just didn't have to, but in a different scenario, I would. But I think the GMAT has sort of trained me to guess and move on. It's not about the amount of time. I felt perfectly comfortable in spending 4 minutes, 5 minutes in one of the GMAT questions because that's the law of averages, right? But if I wasn't getting anywhere, right, even in the GRE, I would just guess and move on. And then I realized, oh, I have actually 5 minutes left on the clock. Let me go back to the question that I was looking at. The other thing also, the GRE gives you a calculator, right? Which to be honest, I don't think it makes a whole lot of difference for the in-person tests, but it makes a lot of difference in the online version of the tests. So because, the GMAT, large numbers doing it on the whiteboard can be pretty challenging.
Yeah, fair enough. And I'm glad you brought up the calculator because that's something that I tend not to talk about as much as I should when I'm helping people through that decision of GRE versus GMAT. Honestly, I don't think it's a big deal. That's why I don't talk about it a whole lot. Again, ignoring the crazy world of online GMAT and GRE, but in normal times when we're in test centers, you can write things down. The GRE is very much written in a way, much like the GMAT in the sense, where there are very rarely numbers large enough where you need that calculator. And if anything, if you rely too heavily on the calculator, you might find yourself choosing really inefficient paths through a quant question.
Right.
So typically, when I do a GRE section, I just retook the real thing last year. I might answer, there might be one question out of every 20 where the calculator really helps and really helps me cut some corners. There might be 3 or 4 more where I'm using it to help verify something, but that's it. And then we tend to see students struggle who just kind of go, oop, I got a calculator, this is great. And then they use it for everything. And meanwhile, there's a much faster way. So it helps less than it sounds like it should help. And for some people, it can actually hurt if you don't use it right.
All right. So before we jump into user questions, I have one more controversial question to ask you, and I'll force you to answer, okay? Cool. Let's say you have a business school, Charles, right? You own the business school, or you're like the dean of admissions or whatever, right? And you have to pick one test, the GMAT or the GRE, as a test for admission. Which test would you pick and why?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a great question.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but GMAT Club Live is a very high intense.
and we're assuming that everything else in the world is the way it is. That GMAT's in the rankings, GRE is not, and that's something we can count on being the case.
There are no rankings involved in this game. Maybe US News has figured out to incorporate both the tests. Okay.
I would pick the GRE, and here's why. Verbal, and there's studies on this, right? So test creators and people who are interested have a stake in what tests do for us in admissions. Run things called validity tests. There's a whole bunch of different ways to do that. But the thing you see the most often is we say, okay, we're going to take a bunch of people, we're going to correlate their GMAT scores or see if their GMAT scores correlate to something else. So does this correlate to your lifetime earnings, your salary after business school, your jobs after business school, generally speaking, the answer is absolutely not. The GMAT quant, again, depends on the study, depends on the sample, but the correlation we see the most frequently is that quant results on the GMAT correlate to grades in the first year of business school. That's about the only thing that seems to persist over time. And we can say similar things about undergraduate admissions. Verbal, there's not a lot of evidence that it correlates to much. Like, yes, we want to make sure that people can form a sentence, can write an essay, do the basics, but we have other ways to figure that out. We make internationals take the TOEFL. Most US business schools do, certainly. I think most international ones do as well, that are operating in English. So look, verbal doesn't mean that much. I'm not sure what it tells us when we have all this other data on people. So if we kind of say, well, the verbal's not a big issue. So if I'm trying to put together the best class I can, the difference between verbal, GMAT versus GRE, I don't really care. Quant, I think the difference in feel of the two tests, I think there's two things. One big thing that we already touched on is if you're anxious and you struggle with your time management on the GMAT, the test might just get it wrong. And you could be really, really, really good at quant and get your butt handed to you on a silver platter because you make careless errors, because you're stressed, because you manage your time badly. Yeah. GRE, I think I'm more likely to get a pure read on your performance, number one. So that's reason number one, where if I'm an admissions committee in Fantasyland where I can dictate everything and I had to choose, I'm going GRE. The second thing is that GMAT does a much better job on quant of making the test about quantitative reasoning and not math. And that sounds like a really pretentious distinction, but the difference,
I totally agree.
It's not, the GMAT's like, you can know all of the underlying math really, really, really well and still struggle to put it together in this kind of puzzly form, logic-based, reasoning-based form. GRE is much more out to just say, hey, do you know geometry? Do you know statistics? Here's where I'm going to throw the ball. Go hit it. And if I'm really interested in putting in the best class I can, I think people who get super, super high scores on the GMAT might not be what we want. No offense to anybody present who has really high scores. I'd rather de-emphasize the testing. And I like that the GRE is just saying, hey, basic math skills, strong enough, statistical skills, strong enough, great. That's good enough. We're not going to mess with you. None of the psychological mind games, or at least fewer of them, in terms of the time management and the stress of the GMAT. And verbal, I don't think the difference really matters much. So I would take the GRE in a heartbeat.
Awesome. I would disagree.
Awesome.
Because of the exact same reason that you picked the GRE, like I feel this is purely anecdotal, right? So there is no data. It's just my feeling, and why not, right? One of the things that I learned is like correlating business school success with a admissions test is sort of difficult because business school success is so different based on where you end up going, and like different industries and functions need different skills and all of that stuff. But I felt that the fact that the GMAT sort of forces you to train on time management is inherently a skill that you'll have to use in business or business school over and over again. And the other thing, I think you're spot on, because the whole thing about quantitative reasoning. The other day I was doing like a GMAT online whiteboard video, and I was getting some really difficult questions. And one of the inequality question, I was like, okay, I was plugging in numbers. And there was this one dude in the comment section. I was like, hey, you're too slow. Like, why are you plugging in numbers? You can just do algebra. Like, first of all, thanks, like, thank you for a beautiful comment. But at the second time, the fact that, like the GMAT sort of forces you to sort of go out of your algebra, because if you just rely on algebra, you're probably going to be wrong because of extreme edge cases and stuff. I really like that. And again, it's just a personal thing. I just like the GMAT so much. Anyway, but that was a fantastic conversation. We have like over 90 people now. So clearly people
awesome.
People would like if you become a dean of a business school and make decisions. All right. So one quick thing before we jump into user questions. We have about 10, 15 minutes left. Charles, I'm assuming you have an announcement to make, right? And I think it's about being back on YouTube. So I have a link ready just in case, but I'll let you handle that.
Awesome. So we are going to do a series of 4 reading comp videos starting this Friday. So this is Friday. I don't know what the date is today. I think it's the 5th. We're going to start these. So we'll do one this Friday, 3 next week. So this is, I don't know, my 30th or 35th video live on the GMAT Club YouTube channel.
Right.
I've pretty much ignored reading comprehension, mostly because I feel like it's boring to watch me go through reading comp passages. I finally caved under pressure from a lot of GMAT Club moderators. So 4 live reading comp videos. I think Souvik's posting the link. Come see us. Visit that thread. If there's certain things you want me to cover, feel free to weigh in the next couple of days. I'll do my best to accommodate, and come see us live and give me crap. And that's what makes it interesting. So come join us.
Awesome. So I just posted the link on the chat. So that's the link with the full schedule. I will later in the day post the YouTube links on that exact post, right? So that you could like bookmark it and come back. One thing that I would just like to mention, and this is, I'm at the risk of making Charles blush a little bit. He doesn't handle praise very well. So his videos have done historically really, really well on GMAT Club. And it's not just, like, I don't know if you remember, Charles, we started doing videos, I think, back in 2015 or something, when we were just playing around on YouTube. And if we got like 20 people watching, we would consider ourselves a huge success. Yeah, Charles was just indulging my YouTube experiment. But since then, his videos get the most number of comments, get the most number of views, and I think we definitely have 500,000 views of all your videos combined. So we are going to pitch to Netflix to get this on board. I'm kidding, but feel free to join the reading comp session. And I have a feeling that if enough of you join and keep pestering him, he's going to do more videos. So I have vested interest in this.
Although maybe not this fall. I might be dropping the mic after this one for a little bit. My wife, by the way, is 6 months pregnant. So,
well, congratulations. This is your second, right?
This is our second, and COVID days here. This video is not going to age while talking about COVID, but COVID days can't get childcare. So do this series, and I might be a little scarce for 6 months or so.
That's totally fine. Awesome. Questions about, start taking questions, but Charles, if you have a preference for a question, let me know and I'll put it up on the screen, right? So I'm going to start with the RC prep from GMAT and GRE. And Charles, you answered the question. If I have any thoughts, I'll jump in, yeah?
Sounds good. That's a really good question. This is one of the things that bugs me about the GRE, to be honest. GMAT...
Hey, treat it as your test, okay? You have to defend this again.
If I were an admissions committee, it's my test. As somebody who tries to help people beat these tests, I have some frustrations with the GRE. That frustration is that the GRE doesn't release a lot of official questions.
Right.
So really quickly, because there's a lot of questions here about which one's easier for verbal. So I'll kind of address both those questions at the same time because they're linked. Structure real quick of the two. GMAT, as I think most of you know, it's about roughly a third reading comprehension, roughly a third critical reasoning, roughly a third sentence correction. Great. So you've got 2/3 reading intensive and 1/3 sentence correction. GRE, half vocabulary questions, half, they call it critical reading. So here's the nuance. So one thing is that if you're better at reading than you are at, let's say, sentence correction or vocabulary, then great. Maybe the GMAT is a little bit of an advantage for you. Now answering the question about how's the preparation for reading comprehension different between the two exams. One of the things that I find frustrating about the GRE on the verbal side is that critical reading is really a hybrid of what we call reading comprehension and critical reasoning on the GMAT.
Yeah.
So what you always see is it's 10 questions per set on the GRE verbal, 10 critical reading questions. There's one passage that has 4 questions, one passage that has 3 questions, one passage that has 2, one passage that has 1. There's some rare variation in that, but that's basically what you always see. 4 passages, one with 4 questions, one with 3, one with 2, one with 1. Here's the thing, the one with the 4 questions, that looks just like GMAT reading comprehension, prepare for it in exactly the same way. The one that's 1 question looks just like a basic GMAT critical reasoning question. You can prepare for that the same way you would GMAT critical reasoning. And now the in-between gets kind of funky. So those other 5 questions almost feel like a hybrid. There's a little logical component to it where it might be a strengthen or a weaken or an assumption kind of question, but it's a little bit longer. So, honestly, GMAT, one of the nice things is we can say, and I'll talk about this in the live reading comp videos, is we can say, hey, go do LSAT. If you start running out of official GMAT reading comp questions, go do LSAT. It's close enough. Yeah. Critical reasoning, go do LSAT. It's close enough, and the supply is essentially limitless. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of questions. When we look at those kind of those mid-sized passages on the GRE, we don't have a lot like it. We've got the GRE official guides, we got the 5 practice tests. That's really it. So that's a little bit frustrating. I'd say the same basic techniques absolutely apply. So we train students the same way on the longer passages, but there's a little bit of an adjustment in just getting used to applying those things when the passage is, let's say, one really long paragraph.
Right.
And we don't have any magical solutions for it. It's just trying to get you to hone in on how do you think about purpose and all of that. So it's not a massive difference. I do want to be honest that once you run out of those official materials and they're really thin for the GRE, you don't have a lot that perfectly mimics or even adequately mimics the GRE on some of those mid-sized critical reading passages.
Awesome. I mean, I generally agree with you, like in life, but on this one too. But I guess my only addition here is that the reason why I like the GMAT a lot is because the test is highly standardized, right? You have a lot of opportunities to practice. Like the GMAT verbal has SC, CR, and RC, and that's it. That's it. That's all you're going to get. Those are the only 3 types of questions allowed. On the GRE, you have like 5 or 6 different types of questions. So it's good for breadth. If you're like good enough for all of these, you're probably going to get a bit better score rather than if you're just good enough at RC, but you really are bad at CR, your GMAT's going to be a bigger tip. But essentially, the RC prep is just very, very similar, I would say.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, fundamentally, it's the same skills. It's just, I think it feels a little different on the GRE. And I'm being a little whiny about my frustration with those mid-sized passages. But the process, fundamentally, the skills, same. So all the things we're going to talk about in RC videos over the next couple of weeks, those techniques basically apply, small variations to adjust for length. That's it. So
if I take the GRE, will it seem like I'm not serious about going to business school?
Don't worry about that.
Absolutely not. You'll be perceived as lazy, who just doesn't want to take the No, the 2 tests are identical in terms of the business school admission processes. The tougher question to answer is like a corollary of your question is like, if I have equivalent scores on the high ranges, will one be more preferred? And now that question is probably towards the GMAT, but you have only if you have only 1 score, the same. It's going to be fine. No, you're going to be just fine. I apologize for making that joke. You're going to be just fine. All right. If you do better on the verbal GMAT versus GRE verbal, would you recommend the GMAT over the GRE? So quickly, my take, and then I'm going to let Charles take over. I think it also depends on your quant, right? I think if you're saying that your verbal GMAT is better than your GRE verbal, keeping quant the same, then of course the GMAT wins because you're just going to have a better overall score. But if you can do better on the GRE quant, but slightly lower on the GRE verbal, but on the GMAT, you have slightly higher verbal, but much lower quant, because quant on the GMAT is decidedly harder than the GRE quant, right? Then the GRE makes more sense. I would take practice tests and then decide for the full sections. What do you think, Charles?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think same thing I said earlier, that if your overall GMAT composite is high for your demographic for the schools you're applying to, go with the GMAT. I wouldn't overthink it too much. And definitely quant plays a bigger role. And I think another way of thinking about how admissions committees think about these tests, there's the pure purpose. So why do these tests exist? We've got all this MBA in particular. We've got tons of stuff on you guys, right? Your applications are just a mountain of information. We've got your social media, adcoms check those sometimes. I'm making people paranoid. And there's so much, right? All these recommendations, your networking, you're meeting people, you've got this work history, you've got your undergraduate record. There's so much information there. Why bother with the test?
Right.
The big reason to bother with the test, the reason these tests were created is we need another data point to make sure that you're going to be okay in graduate level coursework. That's it. Is it a super important data point? Didn't used to be. It was important, but not critical. It's grown in importance because of the rankings. So part 1, what does your test score tell us about how you're going to do in business school, just academically? Part 2, rankings, right? So the part 1 of what does this tell us about your ability to do well in the academics? Quant tells us a lot more than verbal. So yeah, if your quant's the same, to answer the question that's up there, if your quant is the same on the 2, then absolutely go with the GMAT. But if your quant is wildly better on one versus the other and you have to choose, I'd go with one where the quant is stronger, just because I think admissions committees take that much, much more seriously.
Right.
If you have strong verbal, weak quant, we're worried about how you're going to do in econ.
Awesome. Are Buñuel and Charles the same person? No.
No.
All right. So based on what you say, does it make sense for overrepresented categories like the Indian IT male to take the GMAT? I have a 325 and I'm looking to bump it up. Should I reevaluate? What do you think, Charles?
I mean, it's always so complicated, and you're in that, and obviously you know this if you're asking the question. You're in that demographic where, man, it's tough, and I think that particular demographic is so crowded that is there a GRE score? I think the bottom line is if you can get to something like a 760 or above on the GMAT, you probably need to scratch and claw to get there because of just the reality of admissions. And it's terrible. I hate that it works that way, but that's reality. I look at that GRE score and go, that's a really, really solid GRE score. There's plenty of other people who are watching this where I'd go, yep, yeah. 325, 165 quant, we're done. You did it. Done, go apply. And, in that demographic, it's just tough because there's going to be people showing up with 770 GMAT who look like you on paper. So that's the gold standard. I say you do everything you can to get north of a 750 on the GMAT. And if you can't get there, that is a strong GRE score. I just don't know that it's competitive for that demographic. And I hate that that's reality.
Right. So my only thought about this, and I know this guy because he's been around the GMAT Club channel for a while. It's like, I think you can improve on the score, man. So I think this is a great score. It's a great start. Right. And if you're like a blank slate on the GMAT, improving on the score is probably easier than starting the GMAT from scratch, So on that quant score, that you have a 165, it sort of means that you're at a very good place. And I think after this point, getting like a 168 or a 170 is just like being really hard on yourself and being careful. It's being a lot more careful than being a lot better at math. You're already very good at math. So I think you can bump that up by a couple of points. For verbal, I think you can bump that up a couple of points too. And I think it's a better battle than starting over with the GMAT, right? And of course, don't forget the non-testy part of your application. Those will always help you, just look better for your admissions people.
And for context on that 165 on the GRE, I mean, again, depending on exactly what you're missing, that might be 3 or 4 questions away from a perfect score, maybe 5 or 6. Again, just depends on exactly what you're missing. But it's not a lot of questions. And I think Souvik's spot on. If you're at a 165 quant, it might just be a little bit of carelessness. That's the difference between that and something that's very close to perfect. And that might change the narrative for you in admissions. So.
Awesome. We're going to take just a couple more questions. We're sort of running out of, we're clocking in at 40 minutes. Lots of people agree with you on many things. That's always the case, I guess. So 326, hoping for the GRE. Score should I aim? Okay, so overall, check so I would say the ballpark for a top 10, top 15 programs is like a 325 to a 335. It's hard to really know because business schools don't really publish average GRE figures. But Charles is going to make a face, but I would take their average GMAT, go to that conversion tool and see what GRE score comes up.
There's a trickle of data out there, but it's not ideal. What I would say about that score, congrats on the 170. That's amazing. And that's really tough to do. It takes some precision. That's pretty phenomenal. I would say get that verbal score above a 160, just because, again, psychologically, people look at that and go, oh, well, okay, you're above that line that divides average from amazing. So get me 4 or 5 more points on verbal, and I like the way that looks.
All right, so question about percentiles. Is it easier to achieve a 90th% of the GMAT and what with GRE? Look, percentiles by definition will be not super easy. Like a 90th percentile on the GRE would mean like you're scoring better than 90% of the people who are taking the GRE, which can be just as tough as the 90th percentile on the GMAT, which exactly means the exact same thing, unless the overall population who are taking the GRE are scoring significantly with much less prep, which I don't think is the case. But Charles, go ahead.
It is a very different, it's a great question. And it's not one that I've thought very deeply about, just because I tend not to pay a lot of attention to the percentiles, just because I think in terms of what are averages at the schools and what does it take to get there. It's a great question. The test taking pools are very, very different. If you're taking the GMAT, you're going for an MBA. There are very few exceptions, or some sort of graduate business school education. Very, very few other programs accept it. It's a smaller and more specialized pool of test takers, about 250,000 people roughly, or 250,000 tests taken for the GMAT every year. Last time I checked the numbers on the GRE, it was about triple that number.
Right.
And almost every graduate program takes the GRE. So you could be applying for a master's degree in creative writing, for example. You take the GRE. Now that master's program in creative writing doesn't give a crap about the quant score.
Yeah.
So is it easier to achieve 90th percentile on the GRE? Maybe a little bit on the GRE, just because that testing pool, you do get a lot of people that only care about one section or the other, because that's all their graduate program cares about. Right. So my hunch is it's a little easier to get to the 90th percentile, but I'm also not sure that that's the lens that MBA admissions committees are using anyway. So I wouldn't worry about it too much.
Yeah. I mean, there might be some evening effect too, right? Because a lot of people who take the GRE also go for like computer science, also go for math. It can be challenging because the GRE pool is just so big.
It's really broad, and yeah, so it's hard to say, but for what it's worth, a little easier, I think, on the GRE percentile wise, but might not matter for the MBA anyway.
Yeah. Taking a question that I'm uniquely positioned to answer. Today I took the GMAT, and during a break, I went to the toilet and the proctor closed the exam. Can I still get my total score to take the GRE? Well, I mean, I'm just going to do a quick thing on you. Like, you're allowed to leave the room during the break, okay? So I don't know why your proctor closed the exams, but you should write to GMAT and tell them that what happened, because I went out during my exam, during the break. I went out, grabbed some water, went to the bathroom. So definitely write to them. If you don't get a score, they are definitely in line to give you a voucher for a retake. So definitely write to them. Awesome. So I think we are really nearing end time here. So I'm going to try to close it off, but I'm looking forward to Friday. I'm looking forward to reading Comp a lot, right? So that's going to be pretty amazing. But Charles, if you have any closing thoughts, I'd love to get to them too.
No, that's really it. I think I'll say the same thing I said when we've done a couple other videos about online GMAT and GMAT versus GRE in the context of COVID online GMAT weirdness. And don't overthink the decision too much, just because, look, for most people, the performance on the GMAT versus GRE tracks fairly closely. Very, very few people are going to have such a massive advantage on one versus the other that those scores are going to be wildly different. It happens. We've got to concoct very, very specific cases to come up with that. So I would never think it too much. That's not something that should keep you up at night. I'll also say that the transition from certainly from the GMAT to the GRE is not a particularly difficult transition, just because all the quant you study for the GMAT, if you master a lot of the content for quant on the GMAT, you're going to get to the GRE and go, well, there's less of it here. This is fine. Reading comp is close enough to the same. Critical reasoning, okay, formatting is a little different. Skills are the same. Yeah, you've got to adjust to the vocabulary, but in all honesty, like, human brains don't work well typically with memorizing crap loads of vocabulary words. And if you're looking to prep over the course of a month or two, memorizing vocabulary words is a very, very blunt tool. So I'm saying all that just to say that transition from GMAT to GRE doesn't need to take you a lot of time. Yeah. Don't stress too much about the decision. And the one other plug I'll make is that I have a super short video. There's a GMAT Ninja YouTube channel, much smaller than the wonderful GMAT Club channel. I've got a super short video on GMAT versus GRE. And I think I probably said everything today that I said in that video. But if you want the short version with more text overlays, go for it.
Awesome. Well, that's it for us today. Make sure to join us on Friday. We will also have a lot more user videos about people who have successfully taken GMAT, and we're going to learn from them. The first one of that is from Saturday. It's a European test taker. I think she scored a 730. So we're going to do a video with her. But so join us. Exciting things happening. Subscribe to the channel if you want to get notification. That always helps you get to know when the video is up. Also like the video, right? Because that helps us to deliver it to more people. The YouTube algorithm sort of likes videos that get likes for some reason. So like the video. All right, awesome. So thank you so much, Charles, for being here. Right, these are weird times, and I just sort of wake up every morning, and the day is weirder than the day before. I sort of get cumulatively weirder every day. But at the same time, I think doing the GMAT and the GRE stuff sort of helps me be sane and avoid everything that's happening outside.
Yep. And I love getting feedback from people. So if anybody's out there wants to watch these videos live, I thrive off of that. If I'm talking to the camera, feeling alone, it sucks, especially during COVID. So please come, please give us crap, ask questions.
Yeah.
Please participate. It helps us to be happier people and give you guys better videos. So come see us Friday. Come see us next week.
Awesome. See you guys soon. Thanks, Charles. Thanks, everyone.
Everybody. Thank you, Souvik.
Thanks.